Young Guns movies are easily some of the most action-packed, nostalgic westerns ever made. So I decided to try and uncover every secret I could find about the series, including how the cast almost looked very different, why Kiefer Sutherland insisted on a different ending, and the behind-the-scenes accident that almost proved fatal for Lou Diamond Phillips. So with a third Young Guns film on its way soon, I hope you enjoy this compilation of 40 things you didn't know about Young Guns 1 and 2.
Reap the whirlwind, Sheriff Brady. Reap it!
So the idea for Young Guns originally came from screenwriter John Fusco, who'd been fascinated by Billy the Kid ever since the age of 10. This was because when he first saw the famous image of the outlaw in question, he just couldn't understand how such an unconventional, unassuming figure had become such a legend of the Wild West. So, in the years that followed, Fusco began collecting information about Billy the Kid, believing that one day he might write a novel about him. But the moment that really inspired him to write Young Guns came when he first visited the gravesite of Billy the Kid in Fort Sumner, with Fusco explaining that he's buried there with some of his regulators, and the epitaph on the tombstone is one word: pals. When I saw that, I knew I had my theme for Young Guns. And so, from just a single phrase, the concept for Young Guns was born, which Fusco actually references in the film when Billy says,
"Oh, Steve understands the meaning of the word pals, don't you, Steve? So you got 3-4 good pals, well then you got yourself a tribe."
So having just penned the underrated 1986 movie Crossroads, John Fusco decided to write a spec script for Young Guns, but had a lot of pushback from those around him. For example, Fusco said, "In the late 80s, my agents begged me not to pitch my Billy the Kid idea because the Western was dead," referring to the recent $36 million flop Heaven's Gate. But luckily, director Christopher Kane fell in love with Young Guns after reading just 16 pages of the first draft of the script, and agreed to help Fusco raise the $11 million budget required to get the movie made. So with Young Guns officially in the works, attention turned to casting, with the role of Billy the Kid being the top priority, given how important that character is in the movie. And so, Fusco formally offered the role to Sean Penn, who at this stage was probably best known for his role in Fast Times at Ridgemont High. But due to his legal troubles at the time, Penn was unavailable for filming, prompting director Christopher Kane to suggest Emilio Estevez for the part instead, given that they'd already previously worked together on the movie That Was Then, This Is Now. And upon reading the script, Estevez immediately fell in love with it, apparently really excited by the prospect of being involved in an ensemble western. Now, despite the initial difficulties in getting Young Guns financed, as soon as the film cast Emilio Estevez, all of a sudden a stampede of famous young actors came forward in the hope of appearing in the movie. This was because, despite it being a western, the project was deemed by the industry to be a Brat Pack film, a popular brand of movie in the 80s made famous by films like The Breakfast Club and St. Elmo's Fire, which would typically feature an ensemble cast of well-known young actors like Estevez, who frequently appear together in teen-orientated movies. So with Young Guns being viewed as another vehicle for this profitable trend, multiple famous young actors volunteered for a role as a regulator, including Tom Cruise, Jason Patric, Judd Nelson, and Rob Lowe. But despite this sudden influx of interest, it didn't dissuade Fusco and Kane from casting who they actually thought would be the best fit for each part. For instance, the role of Dick Brewer was originally offered to Patrick Swayze, who ironically turned down the part in an effort to break away from the Brat Pack labeling. So instead, the role went to the brother of Emilio Estevez, Charlie Sheen, who were both the sons of the famous actor Martin Sheen. And for the role of Doc, they decided to go with Kiefer Sutherland, who was also the son of a famous actor in Donald Sutherland. But lesser-known actors were cast as well, with Lou Diamond Phillips being sought out due to his breakout performance in La Bamba. Equally, Young Guns gave Dermot Mulroney what was essentially his first major film role, alongside Casey Siemaszko, who was also a relatively unknown actor at the time, having only really appeared in minor roles in Stand By Me and Back to the Future. Young Guns also provided actor Patrick Wayne with one of his more memorable roles as Pat Garrett, having previously appeared in westerns such as The Searchers and Big Jake, alongside his famous father John Wayne. So with the cast for Young Guns officially in place, a lot of the actors took it upon themselves to do research into the real historical figures that they would be playing. For instance, Emilio Estevez did a lot of research into Billy the Kid in an effort to try and understand who he really was. In doing so, he initially believed the famous outlaw to be an angry, abused soul who only really cared about himself. But over time, he came to realise that Billy the Kid was someone who actually thought a lot about other people, especially John Tunstall and his fellow regulators. Equally, Kiefer Sutherland was also encouraged to do research into the character of Doc, with John Fusco apparently offering him relevant history books to read. However, the actor turned them down, opting to approach the role with imagination and dramatic license so as to avoid the movie feeling like a docudrama. So while developing the story for Young Guns, writer John Fusco spent 5 months in New Mexico, researching the life and death of Billy the Kid, wanting his movie to be as accurate as possible. For instance, he managed to work in actual quotes from Billy the Kid into the script, and actually fought back against the studio to take the time needed to get the tintype of Emilio Estevez as close to the real picture as possible. But it would seem that this attention to detail paid off in the end, because despite there being at least 52 films and TV shows about Billy the Kid prior to the release of Young Guns, historian Paul Andrew Hutton deemed the movie to be the most historically accurate movie of its kind as of 1990. Now, despite Fusco doing his best to stay faithful to the true story of Billy the Kid, he was ultimately forced to deviate from history in some areas for the sake of the plot. For instance, in real life, the regulators were actually made up of 11 members, but in the movie it was reduced to 6, to better explore the characters. Also, Young Guns continued the long-established trend of depicting John Tunstall as an older father figure type character, despite the fact that in real life he was murdered at the age of 24, and was actually younger than a lot of the regulators. So once filming started on Young Guns, most of the movie was shot on location in Santa Fe County, New Mexico, so as to try and capture the spirit of the era. And this entailed filming a lot on the Bonanza Creek movie ranch, which was also used for a number of other famous westerns, including Silverado, 3:10 to Yuma, and pretty much every other western you can think of. So due to the action-packed nature of the movie, the cast did a lot of work to get in shape for the film, knowing that it was going to be a very physically demanding job. And as part of their training, the main cast were made to do 6 weeks of horse riding lessons, which eventually descended into chaotic games of horseback tag. But unfortunately, none of this seemed to help Charlie Sheen, who was reportedly a terrible horse rider, constantly falling off his saddle and even losing control of his horse when it got spooked during the Henry Hill shootout. Although he wasn't the only cast member to struggle on set, as Lou Diamond Phillips was deeply afraid of heights and always struggled with any scenes that involved them. So despite the size and scale of the production, it would seem that Young Guns didn't have the most organised set, especially when it came to its stunts and action. For instance, every fight scene shown on screen was completely improvised by the cast and stuntmen. And also, during the Henry Hill shootout scene, someone on set had the crazy idea of packing all of the ammo blanks in the prop guns with ceramic plaster, so that when they fired, they would make a louder bang. Now in fairness, the trick worked, but it also fired a clay-type substance at the cast and crew, apparently catching Dermot Mulroney in the shoulder blade and even hitting Emilio Estevez in the face, who actually had to stop filming for the day to get checked over. So Emilio Estevez easily had the hardest job in the movie of bringing the complex figure of Billy the Kid to life on the big screen. And initially, he really struggled with the role, as Estevez had always been taught to think as an actor and actively interpret what was in the script. However, the character of Billy the Kid was supposed to be very impulsive and raw, which simply wasn't coming across in his performance, due to the way in which he naturally approached acting. So Christopher Kane forced Estevez to do multiple takes of each scene until his lines finally felt spontaneous and reactive. In fact, during the bath scene with Billy and Doc, Kane went as far as to deliver Estevez's lines on cue cards off camera, so as to force the actor to improvise, as if he really was dictating a letter off the top of his head.
I changed my mind. Kiss my ass.
So while filming Young Guns, the main cast had a lot of time to get to know each other, and ended up really hitting it off, given that they were all around the same age and from similar backgrounds. As such, the cast would spend a lot of time drinking and playing music, and when they got drunk, they would apparently make Lou Diamond Phillips perform a private rendition of La Bamba. Also, while filming, Estevez became known as a master prankster, initiating an all-out prank war on set that all started with him sending manure to his co-stars, under the guise that it was a gift from the studio. So all the brotherly camaraderie that you see on screen in Young Guns was totally authentic, and very much an extension of the real friendships that the cast shared in real life. By the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, it would be great if you could leave it a like, just to help share it to others. But anyway, let's get back to it. So while writing the script for Young Guns, John Fusco would often put on Wanted Dead or Alive by Jon Bon Jovi as mood music, to help him get into the head of Billy the Kid. So when Estevez was introduced to Bon Jovi through his Breakfast Club co-star Ali Sheedy, he cheekily asked if he could use Wanted Dead or Alive in Young Guns to play over the end credits. But the musician said no, believing that the lyrics didn't really match the film. However, he did agree to write a new song for Young Guns 2 called Blaze of Glory, which ended up being a massive hit. So perhaps one of the most famous scenes in Young Guns is when the regulators take part in a peyote ritual, leading to some of the funniest moments in the movie.
Dog, did you see the size of that chicken?
Now obviously the cast didn't really take peyote in real life, but to make it look convincing on camera, they decided to fill the bowls with chicken soup instead. So during the filming of the scene in which the regulators pass through a Native American village, Kiefer Sutherland was forced to leave the set to be present for the birth of his child. Now given that he had to rush away on such short notice, there wasn't really a backup plan in place for how they would shoot the scene in question without Sutherland. So in the end, the director had a stand-in pose as Doc, covering his face so that nobody would notice that it wasn't actually Kiefer Sutherland. Now despite Emilio Estevez being the face of the movie, the actor actually had an uncredited second role in the film outside of Billy the Kid. This was because when he wasn't needed on set during the filming of the final shootout scene, he would dress up as one of the gunmen trying to kill Billy, allowing him to play a role in both sides of the conflict without anyone even noticing. Another cameo in Young Guns that most people would never spot is that of Tom Cruise, because apparently the famous actor happened to be hanging around on set one day while filming something nearby, prompting director Christopher Kane to offer Cruise a role in the final shootout of the movie. And surprisingly, the actor agreed, taking on an uncredited role as a gunman in a brief cameo that most people wouldn't even know to look for. So one of the more offbeat scenes in Young Guns is when Charlie visits a brothel to ask an older prostitute to hold him as if she were his mother. Now in the script, it was originally meant to be a lot clearer that this was in fact a final goodbye between Charlie and his biological mother. In fact, there was supposed to be a scene clarifying as much, in which Dirty Steve makes a comment about the woman, prompting Charlie to snap back, revealing to the others that the prostitute was actually his mum. But this scene was cut, leaving an already weird scene just a little bit weirder for those who didn't read between the lines. So considering all the pushback John Fusco experienced from trying to make a western in the 1980s, he was probably a bit worried upon reading the early reviews for Young Guns, because many critics at the time really didn't like the movie, such as the TV Guide, who said, "Young Guns is simply not a very good movie, western or otherwise. Fusco's script provides little character development and muddles the narrative with some unlikely supporting characters." Now despite it falling flat with critics, in the end audiences loved the movie, and Young Guns went on to make $56 million on an $11 million budget, becoming one of the biggest hits of 1988. In fact, it was so successful that it spawned a sequel in Young Guns 2 and played a big part in revitalizing the Western genre for a whole new generation, with many still considering it to be one of the best Westerns ever made. Now despite how successful Young Guns was, one person that really didn't like the movie was Emilio Estevez himself. Because although he loved the script and westerns in general, upon watching the final film he was far from happy, later saying, It wasn't so much that the original Young Guns was such a terrible movie, but I sort of categorized the first one as the first heavy metal western. It bore no relation or no resemblance to the kind of westerns that I admired when I was growing up. I'm a big fan of Sergio Leone, especially Once Upon a Time in the West, so after seeing Young Guns I went, wow, this just didn't do it. It just doesn't have the scope. There wasn't a cohesive storyline, it was sort of a showcase for a group of young actors. But despite his disappointment with how the first movie turned out, Emilio Estevez was still keen to reprise his role as Billy the Kid in Young Guns 2, in which he felt he righted some of the wrongs of the first movie, creating a western that he felt a lot more proud of.
Now, when I go for my guns, you start shooting. But I promise you, you will not make it.
So even before the release of the first Young Guns, its creator and screenwriter John Fusco had already begun work on a second movie. This was because he was personally very passionate about the history of Billy the Kid, and knew that the first movie was really just one part of a larger story from that eventful period in Billy's life. So Fusco penned a direct sequel called Young Guns Hellbent for Leather, which was later renamed Young Guns 2 and released just a couple of years after the first movie, to capitalize on its box office success. So while writing Young Guns 2, John Fusco was adamant about making the movie as historically accurate as possible. And this apparently led the writer to pore through lots of old newspapers from the past, looking for direct quotes from Billy the Kid that he could insert into the script. For example, during the scene in which Billy escapes from jail, he shouts, which is believed to be what the real-life Billy said to Ollinger just before shooting him dead in 1881. Also, the scene in which Billy says,
¿Quién es?
which is Spanish for who is it, and is believed to be the phrase that the real Billy called out to Pat Garrett just before he was supposedly shot. Following the release of the first Young Guns, Emilio Estevez was not actually all that impressed with how the movie turned out, having hoped it would be more like Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in the West. However, when the actor was asked to return for the sequel, he immediately agreed, saying, "I had no hesitation, I was delighted, because I felt I could right some of the wrongs of the first one, that we could make a truly great western, in the tradition of the westerns that I loved growing up." Estevez even watched the 1973 film Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid for inspiration, and made an effort to portray Billy as more mature, vulnerable and sensitive in the sequel, so as to help the audience better connect with the character. And in his mind, this extra effort paid off, as Emilio Estevez much preferred Young Guns 2, saying, "In this one we created characters, we have a story that you can follow, we created characters that the audience cares about." So it turns out that not all of the original regulators were as keen as Estevez to return for Young Guns 2. For instance, when Lou Diamond Phillips was asked to reprise his role, the actor was initially pretty hesitant until he heard about the story, saying,
"I had my doubts about doing a sequel until I read the script. It was quite exciting for me to read that script and say, you know what, I think we can do it better. I think we can do something that exceeds what we started in the first one."
Another regulator who was reluctant to return was Kiefer Sutherland, as doing so would create a scheduling conflict for him as an actor. So Sutherland apparently agreed to reprise his role as Doc on the condition that his character is killed off at the Stinking Springs shootout. Now, given how big of a priority historical accuracy was to John Fusco, he apparently wasn't very keen on the idea, considering that the real-life Doc lived to the age of 80 and died a respectable man in Texas. Fusco had even already written a scene in the script where Doc rides off to Texas to settle down with his bride. But in the end, Fusco didn't really have any other choice but to agree to Sutherland's request, and rewrote the script so that Doc dies, creating a distraction for the gang to escape. So over the course of the second movie, Billy forms a new gang of regulators that included quite a few new faces. The first of which is Arkansas Dave Rudabaugh, an infamous gunslinger and outlaw who joined the regulators after the Lincoln County War. And the actor Fusco picked to play Dave was Christian Slater, an upcoming young talent who had just broken onto the scene with roles in The Legend of Billie Jean and Heathers, making Young Guns 2 one of his first big-budget movie roles. And upon accepting the part, Fusco gave the actor a lot of reading to do in order to research his character, which ultimately informed reaffirmed his performance as one of the most capable regulators in Billy's gang, who also just happened to be one of the least dependable. Also joining the gang for the sequel was Alan Ruck as Henry William French, who never actually existed, and was in fact a composite character of two other real regulators, called Henry Brown and Jim French. And the role proved really valuable for Alan Ruck, who got a chance to showcase his ability to tackle more serious, grounded roles following his breakout comedic performance as Cameron Fry in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Also, another late addition to the Regulators was Balthazar Getty as Tom O'Folliard, who was in fact a member of the real-life gang and was much more of a close friend and confidant to Billy than Young Guns 2 makes out. Now, as easy as it is to forget, Pat Garrett did actually make a brief appearance in the first Young Guns, played by Patrick Wayne, who was actually the son of John Wayne. However, for Young Guns 2, he was replaced by William Peterson, who was delighted to be cast in a western, saying, "I figured I'd been training most of my life for it. I was playing cowboys when I was 3, and I'm not sure I ever stopped." Now, it's still not entirely clear why Wayne was replaced by Peterson, but either way, the actor made the role of Pat Garrett his own, having done a lot of historical research to ensure that his portrayal was as accurate as possible. So it turns out that Peterson wasn't the only Pat Garrett on the set of Young Guns 2, as the character of John Chisholm was played by James Coburn, who famously played Garrett in the Sam Peckinpah classic Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. As such, Peterson actually consulted Coburn for advice on how to approach the role, and Fusco even paid tribute to the veteran actor in the script, when Chisholm says,
You could take those figures and shove them up your arrogant little ass and set fire to them. I don't owe you a goddamn thing.
Which is all but identical to the scene in Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, when Garrett says,
Better take your $500, shove it up your ass, and set fire to it.
Now, regardless of which Young Guns movie you think was the best, Young Guns 2 felt very distinct from the first movie. And a big reason for this was that director Christopher Kane didn't return for the sequel, and instead was replaced by Jeff Murphy, a New Zealand director best known for The Quiet Earth, who went on to direct The Last Outlaw and even acted as a second unit director on the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So as you would expect, Murphy brought his own unique style to the sequel, injecting it with a lot more action and a much faster pace. When filming finally began on Young Guns 2, much of it was shot in New Mexico and Arizona like the first film, once again making use of the famous Bonanza Creek movie ranch. The only problem was that this time filming started in January and continued into the winter months, meaning that in all the scenes where the actors appear hot and sweaty, they were actually totally underdressed and cold. Now, easily the biggest setback that occurred during the filming of Young Guns 2 was the horrific accident that Lou Diamond Phillips experienced while filming. And this all began when the actor was informed last minute that they would be shooting an unscripted getaway scene, in which Phillips was required to ride down an alley wearing a severed noose and handcuffs, which Emilio Estevez was supposed to shoot. The only problem was that because the scene wasn't planned, Phillips had to ride a skittish horse, while wearing an authentic noose rather than a fake breakaway one. So when it came time to film the scene, Estevez fired his prop gun, and unintentionally caused Phillips' horse to bolt, sending him flying backwards onto the ground. However, as he fell, the noose he was wearing got caught on the horn of his saddle, meaning that Phillips was dragged along behind his horse as it galloped off the set. And although the actor did all he could to try and free himself, he was ultimately helpless, badly breaking his arm and kneecap before the noose finally snapped, leaving him barely conscious and fearing for his life. But luckily, the crew were quick to reach him, at which point Emilio Estevez immediately took charge, insisting the medic give Phillips morphine before lying beside his pal and holding his hand for an hour, until a helicopter could finally airlift Phillips to hospital. And once he arrived, the actor was immediately rushed into surgery, temporarily halting production on Young Guns 2. However, after 2 weeks in hospital and 6 weeks of physical therapy, Lou Diamond Phillips thankfully made a full recovery. But even so, the infamous unscripted scene was never reshot, and the rumour is that the sequence in which Dave stabs Chavez in the arm was added in order to hide the fact that Phillips was filming the rest of his scenes with a broken arm. So despite all the mishaps on set, Emilio Estevez did his best to keep the mood light behind the scenes, carrying on the prank war that he started with his fellow regulators during the first movie. So just before Kiefer Sutherland filmed his bathtub scene, Estevez slipped a Baby Ruth candy bar into the water, which later ominously floated to the surface in front of Sutherland and the rest of the crew when they were shooting. However, the actor saw the funny side, as all of the cast were good friends in real life, which clearly showed in their camaraderie on screen. Now, you'd be forgiven for not realizing that the elderly brushy Bill Roberts at the start of the film is actually played by Emilio Estevez, but obviously with a whole lot of makeup. However, this was not always the case, as the producers were dead set against Estevez playing an older version of himself, believing that it would be far too obvious that it was him. So the actor apparently took it upon himself to hire a dialect coach and a makeup artist to help him transform into Brushy Bill. And upon doing so, Estevez wandered off set in costume and managed to trick a group of strangers playing dominoes outside, which impressed the studio so much that they eventually allowed Estevez to play Brushy Bill in the movie, who in fairness does look and sound completely unrecognizable. So while scripting the first Young Guns, writer John Fusco would listen to the Jon Bon Jovi song Wanted Dead or Alive on repeat, with the cast often playing it on set while filming. So during pre-production on Young Guns 2, Emilio Estevez reached out to Bon Jovi for permission to include the song on the soundtrack. However, the musician didn't feel that the song's lyrics really fitted the movie, and instead agreed to write a new, totally original track called Blaze of Glory, which he felt was much more in keeping with the film's setting and story. Bon Jovi even went as far as to recruit legendary musician Jeff Beck to play lead guitar on the song, which absolutely blew up upon its release, hitting #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and winning multiple awards, as well as being nominated for an Oscar for Best Original Song in a Movie that year. So what started as a favour and a bit of a novelty resulted in one of the most popular songs of Bon Jovi's career, while providing Young Guns 2 with a perfect anthem that has helped keep the movie relevant in pop culture many years after its release. Now, as iconic as Blaze of Glory was, Young Guns 2 also benefited from an excellent score from composer Alan Silvestri, who in the same year composed the score for Back to the Future 3, before going on to work on films such as Forrest Gump, Castaway, and The Avengers. And while composing Young Guns 2, Silvestri made sure to work closely with Bon Jovi, blending rock elements into the overall score to cleverly tie Blaze of Glory into the larger musical identity of the film. So after everything that Bon Jovi contributed to Young Guns 2, it makes sense that the musician would be offered a cameo in the movie. And so, in the pit rescue scene, you can actually spot him playing a dirty, long-haired prisoner who ultimately gets shot in the chest. Also alongside him is writer John Fusco, who cameos as one of the prisoners in the pit. So possibly as a result of its new director, Young Guns 2 proved to be a lot more provocative than the first movie, especially with the addition of characters like Jane Greathouse. And as such, her fellow prostitute Dove was actually played by adult film star Ginger Lynn. Also, when Billy admits to Doc that he made up the broken trail to Old Mexico, he reveals that he named it Blackbird after a biracial prostitute. But in reality, Fusco actually called it that in reference to a ZZ Top song of the same name. So outside of a few returning characters, Young Guns 2 doesn't make all that many references to the events or characters from the first film. Although, one subtle callback that you might have missed is when Dave deridingly calls Chavez a Mexican, to which he responds,
Mexican Indian, you son of a bitch.
And this is exactly the same way he responded in the first movie, when he said,
Mexican Indian, you son of a bitch.
So when Young Guns 2 eventually released in August 1990, it opened alongside big hitters such as Ghost, Flatliners, and Die Hard 2. Yet despite this, the movie made $59 million on an estimated budget of $20 million, actually improving upon the $56 million that the first film made, with the sequel apparently being a big hit on video rental. It was also part of a real standout year for westerns, releasing alongside Dances with Wolves, Back to the Future 3, and Quigley Down Under. But despite Young Guns 2 being an undeniable commercial success, it went down a lot better with audiences than it did critics, who absolutely hated it. For example, Rolling Stone said, "The action and the acting are so listless that the only honest reaction to what transpires on screen is a healthy snore." Equally as negative about the film was the Washington Post, who called it a roundup of tired cliches and tired acting. Except for Sutherland and Peterson, Young Guns 2 is dull as beans and lazy as tumbleweed. But despite its poor critical reception, Young Guns 2 has garnered somewhat of a cult following, and is still a much-loved western over 34 years on from its release. Even Emilio Estevez himself is proud of how it turned out, saying, "It's just all round a better film. It's much grander, the music is better, we shot it in scope. I think that what we set out to do is make a better film, and I think we succeeded." In fact, Young Guns 2 and the larger franchise has had such a lasting impact on fans that the upcoming third movie sounds like a recipe for success, just as long as Emilio Estevez can find a way to finally get it made. But until then, let me know below what is your personal favourite Young Guns movie, and while you're here you might also want to check out this video right here.